Well, March 18th of 2020 at about, I want to say about 6:45, almost 7 o'clock p.m., I was sitting in this very chair doing a live version of the Stratosphere Lounge, and somebody announced in the live stream comment section that the state of California had just announced that it was locking down at midnight and you needed to be home by then. And that for me was the day that the COVID-19 pandemic began 1 year ago, pretty much as we speak. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. And this one is yet another COVID-19 show, but hopefully one with a little bit more of a twist, if nothing else. Guys, I thought what we would do is we are now 1 year into this thing. And there's no question that despite all of the fear porn, we're coming out of it. The rates continue to fall, and we're definitely starting to get out of this with inoculations and so on. And you can see Scott Ott's very own episode about that this week on Right Angle. But what I thought we would do that might be kind of interesting would be simply this. What would you tell yourselves if you could talk to yourself on March 18th of 2020 when it looked like the world was about to end? At least that was on the table in terms of what we were being told in terms of 2 weeks to flatten the curve. What would you tell yourself then? What would you say? Here are things that didn't pan out. Here are things that did. Here's what you should have watched out for. Here's a mistake we made. Steve, can we start with you? If you had to go back in time 1 year exactly to the real beginning of the lockdowns and the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020, what would you tell yourself?
Wow. Two things. I'll get to what they would be in just a moment. I remember during the initial, I don't want to say panics. There was never any panic, at least not here in my neighborhood, in my house anyway. Not with my in-laws down the street or my brother-in-law in town. Nobody panicked. But we had a heightened level of concern, maybe overly heightened. I remember in the very early days when the grocery store shelves were hit and miss on whether you get the particular food items that you actually wanted or needed, my wife and I, we divided and conquered on the grocery shopping. This is America, you know? It was Boris Yeltsin going into that grocery store in Texas that convinced them they lost the Cold War already because the shelves were full in this tiny grocery store in this not big town in Texas. And to see empty grocery store shelves in America was really, really off-putting. You know,
really?
There's not
yes, it was
a hurricane bearing down on you. So my wife would go to one grocery store and I would be at the ready. She would text me with the things she couldn't find as she's shopping, and I would get in my car and go to the other grocery store and see if I could get the things that she wasn't able to find at the first one. And I remember the first few times that we did this on a weekly basis, and we probably did it for about 2 months. On the drive home, I'm being so careful. You know, I get the groceries into the car. I get into the car. I'm rubbing my hands with the hand sanitizer, and I'm driving home and get a little itch on your face, right? Which normally you just do one of these. Except no, I'm not going to touch my face. And thank goodness it's only a 6.5 minute drive home. Oh my God, I'm going nuts. I want to touch my face, right? But you don't, because we learned that, you know, with the doctor in Wuhan, the Chinese doctor who died getting the stuff in his eye. Turns out it was a huge viral load and unlikely to happen to anybody who's not a doctor in this kind of a situation. But we didn't know these things yet. And so we overreacted. But the first thing I would tell myself is don't listen to the experts so much. Be sensible. Do what you were going to do. I remember by the time the lockdown order came here in Colorado, we had already, and when I say we, I mean pretty much our entire school district, had taken our kids out of school. We were keeping our older in-laws at home and delivering stuff to them. We were doing the things you would normally do. So my advice to me would be just turn off the TV, turn off the radio, don't listen to the experts. They don't know what they're doing either. It can only make things worse to listen to, you know, Fauci change his story every 48 hours. So that would be my first bit of advice. My other bit of advice would be to go rebel bigger and sooner. You know, Bill, I'm with you. Hardly anything pisses me off more than the directional arrow stickers on the floor of grocery stores. Mm-hmm. This way, this way, this way, this way, this way. You know,
stand here, 6 feet distance. Yeah.
Yeah. I know where the stuff is I need. And if I'm going to need to go the wrong way up a grocery store aisle, guess what? I'm going to do that. I was doing that from day one. I actually got stopped by a Karen First time they had the stickers on the floor. I'm pushing my cart up the wrong way up the aisle. You know, they have arrows on the floor to show you which way to go. I said, well, yeah, I know, but the thing I need is right there, so I'm getting it. And then she continues to go on explaining to me the thing she just explained to me. And I finally said, you know what? You've told me that. I understood it. I'm going about my business now. Thank you.
I would have tased her on sight.
I really should have, but all I had was mace, and I didn't want to get any of it on the groceries.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So I would tell myself to go rebel bigger, not just in the small ways, and do it sooner, but also use the same common sense that we were already using as Americans, as a country, before the big lockdowns even began.
Simple question, Steve, just to follow up, very simple answer. Would you tell yourself that things are going to be worse than you thought, or they're going to be better than you thought? In other words, if you're talking to yourself a year ago, would you say, don't worry, things are not going to be as bad as you think they are now? Or would you say, oh my God, no, things are going to be much worse? Every death is a tragedy. Let's get that off the table right now. I haven't lost anybody, but I know people who have lost people. Absolutely. And it is god awful. And the people that they've lost went alone with a tube down their neck and nobody to see them. And it's awful. On the other hand, as far as once-in-a-century pandemics go, we got off pretty lucky. As Bill, to borrow your phrase, COVID-19 is a picky eater. We know who it likes to go after. It's relatively easy to protect them, unlike the Spanish flu of 100 years ago, which went after healthy people in their 20s and 30s, in their primes, which really shuts down the economy because those are the people, do the work in the factories and everything else. Yeah. The politics, absolutely worse than I could have imagined in my worst Ayn Rand and whiskey-fueled nightmare. Yeah. Scott, what about you? When these infection rates were going up and hospital ships were sailing into LA Harbor and New York Harbor and the Javits Center, you could see they were putting beds and cots in stadiums and we were really beginning to look like, okay, this is really going to be it. If you could talk to yourself a year ago and counsel yourself, what would you say?
It's interesting because all that stuff you described, I remember seeing on the TV, and this is probably just a product of my distorted mentality, which I've enjoyed throughout my long life. But when I see that stuff on TV, I watch it like it's a movie. Like it doesn't really seem related to me specifically. But then there are micro events that I'm involved in and engaged in that really do connect and make a difference. So yeah, you can see that there's some big thing happening all over the country, whatever the big thing of the moment happens to be. But really, I think more about the stuff that happens locally. Down the street, we have a neighbor named John whose house sits right on the edge of Lake Louisville, and he's lived there for a long, long time. The house is kind of run down, but it's incredibly valuable because it sits right on the lake, and we would go and sit with John in the evenings as the sun was going down out on his porch. John was in his early 90s at the time, and we'd watch the sun go down and just talk to John, and he'd tell us about his life and about his wife, whom he missed, who passed away a number of years ago, and then he got sick and had to be hospitalized, and we couldn't go see him, and we couldn't get into the hospital to see him. And then eventually they transferred him to like a care facility, and we could go to see him there, but we couldn't go into the building. And in one of the care facilities that he was in, I remember that Stephanie and I stood outside in the rain under this tree that was kind of dripping on us, leaning against the screen door. And the nurse inside had handed John a phone. And so we're talking to him on a cell phone and looking at him through the screen and just listening to his suffering. And then they moved him to another facility that was more like a hospice care thing. And again, we went and leaned against a screen and talked to him on the phone. And he eventually passed away in that facility. And what I would have told myself
as a result of COVID-19?
No. The COVID aspect of this is not being able to go visit him. Right. So he didn't have COVID himself, but and I just thought, what would I have done if I had known all this on March 18th? I would have spent more time on John's deck watching the sunset before they took him to the hospital. I would have, when we spent that month that I was off work because they shut the store down, Stephanie and I did an awful lot of fishing, and our viewers who are familiar with fishing will understand the difference between fishing and catching. And we were fishing. And that was magnificent, sitting by the side of the lake and being with my wife and just fishing and loving being outdoors. I probably would have told myself back then, find a way to get a different kind of work that doesn't require you to be away from your wife so much and doesn't require you to walk around with a mask on 8 hours a day. That would have been the other advice. And then my final bit of advice would have been, sell the truck, sell the guitar, sell all the extra computer gear you have sitting around here, and buy Bitcoin. Because, brother, that Bitcoin on March 18th was at about something like $5,200. As I checked it this morning, it was about $55,000. And it would have been good to have a lot more Bitcoin than I actually do. But you could say the same thing about the stock market. The stock market had a really good year, and but not quite as good as Bitcoin did.
I feel the same need to qualify this the same way everybody else has, and that is this pandemic cost hundreds of thousands of lives in this country. And to talk about the societal scale of it is not for a moment to mitigate or to lessen any individual person's loss or suffering. I'm talking about on the largest possible scale. If I could talk to myself a year ago when I was thinking about how badly overflowing the hospitals were going to be, I would have told myself that the two people in my immediate family who I did not think would make it through this pandemic. I have a sibling who has extreme respiratory issues prior to this, very serious respiratory issues. And I have a mother in a Florida nursing home who was 90 years old during the pandemic, her 90th birthday. And sitting here a year ago, I didn't think either one of them would make it through this. That's the truth. I thought there was a good chance for the sib to survive, but I didn't think there's any chance my mom would, especially when I heard within the first 3 or 4 weeks that there had been cases in that particular nursing home. Well, they both survived. So on one hand, I think I could say, looking back, that I could tell myself it is not going to be as bad as you thought it might be from a strictly medical point of view. You are not going to see corpses on the street. You're not going to see hospitals overflowing. You're not going to see people with heart attacks sitting outside the emergency room because there is no physical space for them inside the emergency room. All of these nightmares that flattening the curve was supposed to avoid, they didn't happen. And I would tell myself that we did flatten the curve, and we flattened the curve really, really effectively, to the point where these hospital ships sailed away with virtually no patients on board. The Javits Center never really was fully used. All of these worst case scenarios simply evaporated. So I would say, yes, medically, it's not going to be nearly as bad as you thought. But in every other way, it is going to be so much more awful than you can possibly imagine. I told my wife, who's here, just got her permanent resident card and is working on her citizenship. I told her that American citizens would never tolerate being locked in their houses and being told to wear masks for anything more than the 2 or 3 weeks it would be necessary to flatten out this bulge of initial cases. I was wrong about that. I was deeply wrong about that, and I continue to be ashamed at our politicians, and I'm ashamed at the citizens' willingness to allow them to manipulate us well beyond the limits of their appointed powers. I just didn't think that would happen. The night that I spoke about 1 year ago, right after I left the show here, we went to the drugstore to get some supplies. And that was the first time in my experience where I've ever encountered empty shelves in an American store. And And when I found out that there were no paper products of any kind to be had, period, it was the only time during the pandemic that I actually cried outside in the parking lot. I didn't cry because my feelings were hurt. I just cried out of shame is what it was. I was ashamed that somebody would come in and leave the store with genuinely 40 packages of toilet paper. I was ashamed that Americans would be capable of doing that. But that was nothing compared to what I've seen with the politicians. My clearest memory of the whole thing was watching the tweet that Elon Musk put out saying, here are the predictions for the state of California. Here's where the numbers are based on the predictions. And this is the total number of beds that are being occupied. That happened in April, so just a little less than a year ago. And that was when I realized, and I've realized every day since then, that the response to this had nothing to do with the data whatsoever. Nothing to do with the data whatsoever. And the destruction of faith in the people who we had trusted to keep us informed as citizens evaporated when I saw how easily they not only made the reach for power, but how easily we basically let them have it. I'll just close this by saying this. I suspect, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect that when we look back on it, the COVID-19 thing will be seen as essentially a drill, an exercise with a global pandemic that turned out to be not terribly infectious, or I should say not terribly fatal as far as the potential for some of these things. And it was an exercise in terms of learning how to do things like social distancing, but it was also an exercise to watch how a government can call for emergency measures without ever putting a limit on them in terms of time or a limit on them in terms of conditions. And we simply took it. And I don't think I'm going to let that happen again. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you right here on Right Angle next week.